The August heat in Nashville never really let go, not even after the sun went down. By 9 o'clock at night, the air still sat heavy and thick against the skin, carrying the smell of fried food from the vendors outside Bridgestone Arena, and the faint sweetness of spilled beer that had soaked into the concrete over decades of concerts and sporting events. The kind of heat that made men pull at their collars and women fanned themselves with whatever they had in their hands. A program, a phone, a folded map grabbed from a tourist kiosk on Fifth Avenue. Danny Kowalski had stopped noticing the heat years ago. He stood at his post near Gate C, arms crossed over the chest of his black security polo shirt, watching the last of the crowd filter out through the wide glass doors. His eyes moved the way they always moved on show nights, slow, methodical, reading faces and body language, the way a man reads a road he's driven 1,000 times, looking for trouble without expecting to find it. Most nights, he didn't. Tonight had been a George Strait show, the last stop of a massive farewell tour that had been selling out arenas for the better part of 18 months. The crowd that filed past Danny was different from the usual Nashville concert crowd, older, for the most part, though there were plenty of younger faces too, kids who had grown up hearing their parents play oceanfront property or Amarillo by morning on long drives through the countryside. People who wore boots because they actually owned boots, not because they'd bought them for the occasion. Women in sundresses with their hair up, holding hands with men in pearl snap shirts and well-broken-in Wranglers. Couples in their 60s and 70s, moving slowly but smiling wide, still humming as they stepped out into the thick night air. Danny watched them go and felt the familiar hollow ache settle somewhere below his sternum. He recognized it the way you recognize an old injury. Not sharp anymore. Not the kind of pain that stopped you cold, but present, constant, a dull reminder. He had been a George Strait fan since he was 7 years old, sitting in the cab of his father Roy's pickup truck somewhere outside Odessa, Texas. The radio turned up loud enough to rattle the dashboard. Roy Kowalski had loved country music the way some men loved religion, deeply, quietly, and without any need to explain it. He'd sung along in a low, rough baritone that Danny had spent years trying to imitate in secret, alone in the barn behind their house, thinking no one could hear him. Turned out, someone always heard you. That was something Danny had learned young. He just hadn't remembered it when it mattered. Kowalski. The voice crackled through the radio clipped to his belt. It was Pete Garza, head of security for the arena's event staff. We're sweeping the upper levels. You good on the east side? Danny unclipped the radio. Good here. Last of the crowds moving through Gate C. Copy. Once it's clear, do a final pass on the loading dock and the south parking structure. Crew's almost done loading out, but we had a couple stragglers near section 112 we're moving along. On it. He clipped the radio back and turned his attention to the remaining trickle of concert-goers pushing through the exit. A woman in her 50s caught his eye as she passed. She was crying, not from distress, but from something else entirely. The kind of tears that come when something beautiful ends, and you know it won't come back. She had a tour program pressed to her chest, like she was holding something sacred, and her husband had his arm around her shoulders, saying something low and gentle that Danny couldn't hear. He looked away. 41 years old. Security guard at an arena in Nashville, Tennessee. 11 years on the job. He knew every corridor in this building, every exit and entrance, every loading bay and equipment room and electrical panel. He knew which concession stand had the longest lines and which bathrooms flooded when it rained. He knew the names of every full-time staff member and most of the part-time event crew. He was good at his job, reliable, professional, and almost entirely invisible, which was exactly how he preferred it. Danny had not always been invisible. There had been a time, a specific, burning window of time between his 23rd and 28th year, when he had been the kind of man people noticed. Not famous, not even close, but present. A musician with a voice that stopped conversations in small bars from Lubbock to Austin. A guitar player with calloused fingers and a natural instinct for the space between the notes. He had played every honky-tonk and roadhouse and county fair from West Texas to the outskirts of Nashville, pulling audiences in with the kind of raw, unpolished delivery that made people set down their drinks and actually listen. He'd written his own songs. That was the part he'd been most proud of. Not the covers, not the crowd pleasers, but the original material. Songs about dust roads and broken-down trucks and fathers who didn't say much but meant everything. Songs about the particular loneliness of being young and hungry in a landscape that was vast and indifferent. Songs that came from somewhere real, somewhere he could only access when he was alone with his guitar at 2 in the morning, the rest of the world asleep. He hadn't played in 12 years. The last of the crowd pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the Nashville night. Danny stood alone in the corridor for a moment, listening to the building settle into its post-show quiet. The low hum of the HVAC system, the distant clatter of a cleaning crew somewhere above him, the echo of his own breathing. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the day's tension sitting there like a knot he couldn't quite reach. He had work to do. The loading dock on the south side of Bridgestone Arena was a different world from the public-facing grandeur of the main entrances. Back here, everything was functional and unglamorous. Wide concrete bays, industrial lighting that buzzed faintly overhead, heavy rubber bumpers along the loading edges, the smell of diesel and cardboard, and the particular sour note of a building that processed tens of thousands of people on a regular basis. Semi-trucks were backed up to 3 of the 6 bays, their rear doors open, swallowing the equipment that George Strait's touring crew had spent the last 2 hours breaking down, with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. Danny made his way through the dock methodically, nodding to the crew members he recognized, checking for anything out of place. A road manager he'd seen at previous events, a compact, efficient woman named Carol Hutchins, was working her way through a clipboard of inventory, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, calling out numbers to a young assistant who tapped them into a tablet. "Night, Danny," she said, without looking up. "Night, Carol. You almost done?" 40 minutes, give or take. Band bus left an hour ago. We just need to close out the equipment. I'll be in the south structure if you need anything." She gave a small, distracted wave and went back to her clipboard. Danny pushed through the heavy fire door that connected the dock to the south parking structure and climbed the half-flight of concrete stairs that brought him to level 1. The parking structure was nearly empty now. The event overflow lots were always the last to clear. And on a Tuesday night in late August, people had jobs to get back to. The vast majority of the 600 or so vehicles that had filled these levels 5 hours ago were gone, their absence leaving the structure feeling cavernous and oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that had texture to it, that pressed against the ears. His footsteps echoed as he walked the first level, checking corners, checking the stairwells, making sure no one had decided to sleep it off behind a concrete pillar. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with that particular frequency that set the teeth slightly on edge if you listened too long. Danny had learned not to listen. He worked his way through level 1 and up the ramp to level 2. Emptier still up here. Maybe a dozen cars scattered across a space that held 300. His flashlight swept methodically across the shadows near the far wall, catching nothing but dust motes and a discarded program that had blown against the concrete divider. He was heading toward the ramp to level 3 when he stopped. At the far end of level 2, parked in the wide corner space near the exit ramp, that led to the lower loading area sat a bus. Not a charter bus, not a city transit vehicle that had wandered into the wrong lot. A tour bus. The long, sleek kind with tinted windows and a custom paint scheme, dark blue and silver, with a small logo on the side that Danny recognized immediately, even from 40 yards away. George Strait's personal tour bus. The man's name wasn't written anywhere on it. That wasn't how these things work. But Danny had seen it pulling in and out of the loading area all day. And he knew it, the same way he knew every other detail of his environment. It was part of his job to know. He frowned slightly and keyed his radio. "Pete, this is Kowalski. I've got the artist's personal bus still in the south structure, level 2. Is there a reason it hasn't pulled out with the rest of the convoy?" A pause, static. Then Pete's voice. "Yeah, I got word on that about an hour ago. Driver said there was an issue with one of the air systems. Mechanics coming at midnight to look at it. Artist may or may not still be on board. I think everyone cleared out to the hotel, but they left the bus to be fixed. Just leave it be. It's cleared with building management." "Copy," Danny said. "I'll keep the level secure." He clipped the radio back and stood there for a moment, looking at the bus. The windows were dark and deeply tinted. You couldn't see anything from the outside, which was the point. The parking structure was quiet around it. The distant hum of Nashville's nighttime traffic filtering in through the open sides of the structure from 7 stories below on the street. Danny turned and began his sweep of Level 2's far side, moving along the outer wall where the open gaps let in the night air and the amber glow of the city below. He could see the Cumberland River from up here if he angled toward the east-facing gap, a dark ribbon catching the lights of the bridges, moving slow and steady the way rivers do, indifferent to the business of the city on its banks. He stood at the gap for a moment. Below him, Nashville hummed. The honky-tonks on Broadway would be going full tilt right now. Live music pouring out of every open door. Tourists 2 and 3 deep at the bars. The city performing itself for the people who came to see it. Danny had been in most of those bars years ago. Had played some of them. Had stood on those small stages with the cheap monitors and the sticky floors and felt, for the duration of a set, like the most alive version of himself that existed. He exhaled slowly through his nose and turned away from the gap. That was when the song started playing in his head. It happened sometimes. Not often. Not anymore. But sometimes. A melody surfacing unbidden, the way a song heard in childhood resurfaces when you least expect it. Fool-hearted memory. He'd heard it tonight, of course. Heard it from his post near the corridor where the music filtered through the walls during the show. A ghost of sound traveling through steel and concrete to reach him. George Strait had played it mid-set, the arena going quiet in that particular collective intake of breath way that only happened with the songs everyone knew by heart. Danny had felt it through the wall, literally felt it. The low frequencies of it. The particular frequency that good country music hit. Somewhere in the chest. He walked the perimeter of Level 2, and the song played on in his head. And before he was fully aware of what he was doing, he was humming it. Low, under his breath. The way a man hums when he thinks he's alone. Just the melody at first. The clean, aching arc of it. His breath giving it shape in the warm night air of the parking structure. He stopped near a concrete pillar, maybe 25 yards from the tour bus, and leaned his back against it. Rolled his shoulders. Listened to the quiet. Then, barely above a whisper, just air and muscle memory and something he hadn't touched in 12 years, he sang, "Fool-hearted memory, why can't you just let me be?" His voice came out rough at first, unpracticed, the edges uncertain. But the pitch was there. It had always been there. That was the thing about a voice. It didn't forget the way the hands forgot, didn't need the years of maintenance that the guitar required. The instrument was built in, and it remembered even when the man carrying it had spent a decade trying to pretend it didn't exist. He sang quietly, to no one, to the concrete and the buzzing lights and the distant sound of the city below. And something happened that he hadn't expected. The roughness began to smooth out. His chest opened slightly. His shoulders dropped. And the voice that emerged was not the voice of a 41-year-old security guard in a parking structure in Nashville, Tennessee, but something older and more essential than that. The voice of a boy in the cab of a truck outside Odessa, learning what music could do to the inside of a person, learning that some things couldn't be explained, only felt. He sang the first verse and into the chorus, and his eyes were closed now. His head tilted slightly back against the pillar, the flashlight hanging loose at his side. He had no idea that the window on the near side of the tour bus, the small, narrow window toward the rear sleeping area, was cracked open 2 inches. He had no idea that anyone was inside. He had no idea that a man who had been making music for 45 years, a man who had heard 10,000 voices in 10,000 rooms, was sitting very still on the other side of that tinted glass, listening to every word. George Strait had not been able to sleep. This was not unusual on the last night of a tour stop. His body had a habit of running hot after a show. The adrenaline of 2 hours on stage taking its time to wind down, regardless of how tired the rest of him was. He'd sent his assistant, Kevin Blake, to the hotel with the rest of the group when word came about the bus mechanical issue. The repair crew was coming at midnight. It was currently 11:14, and George had decided to stay with the bus rather than go to the hotel and come back in less than an hour. He sat in the rear lounge in the dark, his stockinged feet up on the bench seat across from him, a glass of water on the small table beside him. Not reading, not watching anything, just sitting in the particular quiet that he had learned to seek out after decades of noise. The parking structure around the bus was empty and still. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, the faint buzz of the overhead lights through the thin, cracked window he'd opened because the recycled air of the bus felt too still without some connection to the outside. He was thinking about the show, about the crowd, about what it meant that this was, genuinely, this time, with real intention behind it, the final major tour. He had made peace with that, mostly. The music wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. But the machine of the touring life, the load in and load out, and the green rooms and the bus rides between cities, that particular chapter was closing, and he was sitting in its last pages right now, in a dark bus in a parking structure in Nashville, drinking water at 11 o'clock at night. Then he heard something. It started so quietly that he thought at first it was the radio left on at low volume somewhere in the front of the bus. A country station, maybe. The frequency drifting. But it wasn't quite right for a radio. Too close. Too present. Too human. He sat forward slowly and cocked his head, listening. A voice. A man's voice, somewhere outside the bus, maybe 20 or 30 feet away from the sound of it, singing fool-hearted memory, not performing it, not projecting, not reaching for anyone, just singing it the way a person sings when they are completely alone, and the song is for no one but themselves. George sat very still. The voice was rough with disuse. He could hear that. The kind of roughness that came not from damage, but from years of not being used, like a well-made instrument left in a case too long. But beneath the rust was something that made him go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the polite attention he paid to the auditions and demos that crossed his desk through the record label. This was different. This was the voice of someone who had something real to say and had, somehow, never found the room to say it. He reached carefully for the narrow window above the bench and angled it open another half-inch, as slowly and silently as he could manage. The voice came in cleaner. George Strait sat in the dark of his tour bus in the south parking structure of Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, Tennessee, and listened to a stranger sing his own song back to him with more raw feeling than he'd heard in years, and he did not move, and he did not make a sound. He listened to every word. Danny Kowalski had been born in Odessa, Texas, on the 15th of February, 1985, during a cold snap that had dropped the temperature in the Permian Basin to 12 degrees. Unusual enough that his father Roy had talked about it periodically for the rest of his life, as though the weather that night had been a sign of something, though he never specified quite what. Roy Kowalski was a man of few words and considerable depth, the kind of man the West Texas landscape seemed to produce with some regularity. Hard-surfaced and sun-weathered on the outside, carrying something tender and unspoken in the interior that only revealed itself in sideways ways. He worked the oil fields for 30 years, roughneck work that paid steadily and cost the body in increments, and he came home each evening smelling of crude and steel and the particular fatigue that physical labor deposits in the bones. He cooked his own dinners after Danny's mother, Linda, left. Danny was 9, and kept the house clean in a functional, no-frills way, and drove Danny to school and to Little League and to the dentist in Midland with the quiet, uncomplaining consistency of a man who understood that showing up was the primary form of love available to him. On weekends, Roy played guitar. Not professionally, not even semi-professionally. Just for himself, in the small living room of the house on Clement Street. The television off, the curtains drawn against the afternoon glare, his old Martin D28 on his knee, and a glass of iced tea on the side table. He played George Strait, and Merle Haggard, and Lefty Frizzell, and Willie Nelson, and occasionally his own things, fragments and progressions that never quite became finished songs, but that had a quiet, melancholy beauty that Danny absorbed from the doorway of the hallway, pretending to be on his way to somewhere else. When Danny was 12, Roy taught him the basic chords: G, C, D, E minor, A minor. They sat together on the couch with the Martin between them, Roy's rough hand over Danny's smaller one, pressing the fingers into the frets with patient, wordless repetition. Danny's fingers hurt for 2 weeks until the calluses formed, and Roy said nothing about it except, "It gets easier," which was as close as he got to encouragement. By 14, Danny was better than Roy. Neither of them said this explicitly, but both of them knew it. There was a fluency to the way Danny played that went beyond technical proficiency. He had what musicians called feel, the ability to understand the emotional architecture of a song and inhabit it, to play it from the inside rather than the outside. Roy recognized it the way you recognize something in a child that comes from you but has grown beyond you. And his response was to drive Danny to a music store in Midland and buy him a used Fender Telecaster and a small practice amp, handing over the cash with the slightly gruff economy of a man who was moved by something he had no language for. "Don't waste it," Roy said, which was the closest he ever got to "I believe in you." Danny didn't waste it. By 18, he was playing every weekend at bars and venues around Odessa and Midland, making enough money to cover gas and pick money and the occasional meal, building a small local reputation on the strength of a voice and a stage presence that consistently surprised people who came in expecting a kid and found something else entirely. He wrote songs in the margins of his high school notebooks and recorded rough demos on a handheld recorder in his bedroom. Listening back to them with the critical intensity of someone who already knew there was a larger world he was supposed to reach. At 22, he drove to Nashville in a truck with a guitar in the back seat and $2,000 saved. And he spent the next 3 years doing what every young musician does in Nashville, playing any room that would have him, working day jobs to cover rent, circulating his demos, building relationships one handshake at a time, getting close enough to the machinery of the music industry to understand how it worked without quite getting inside it. He met Diane Calloway at a show in 2009. She was 24, a schoolteacher from Franklin, Tennessee, with dark hair and a direct, intelligent way of looking at a person that Danny found immediately disarming. She came to his shows twice before she agreed to have dinner with him, and she married him 14 months later in a small ceremony outside Franklin with 17 people in attendance. Roy driving up from Odessa in the pickup and wearing the same sport coat he'd owned since 1987. Tyler was born in 2011. Danny was 26 and terrified and overwhelmed with a feeling he had no adequate words for. This animal, ferocious love for a small person who had not existed until he did, who had arrived already complete, already himself. He held Tyler in the delivery room with hands that were still calloused from the guitar, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused, serious expression of the newly born. And Danny understood, immediately and without question, that his life had reorganized itself around this new center of gravity. He kept playing, he kept writing, he kept pursuing the thing he had been pursuing since he was 14 years old in Roy's living room. And then, in the fall of 2013, he stopped. Not gradually. Not with any of the slow erosion of ambition that claimed most musicians who didn't make it. The incremental retreat, the quiet compromise, the slow renegotiation of what was possible and what was not. It happened in a specific way, on a specific night. And it had nothing to do with the music business and everything to do with a decision he made at 28 years old that he had been paying for ever since. He did not think about that night if he could help it. He had become very skilled at not thinking about it. The morning after the George Strait show, Danny woke at 7 in his apartment on Gallatin Avenue, third floor of a building that was not quite run down, but had clearly made peace with the idea of not being renovated, and lay on his back staring at the ceiling for 4 minutes before getting up. This was his standard morning. He had a routine that he had refined over years into something that required no decisions before he was ready to make decisions. Coffee in the French press, 3 minutes, 12-grain bread in the toaster, eggs in the cast iron. He ate at the small table by the window that looked out over the parking lot and the convenience store across the street. And he read the news on his phone without much engagement, the information passing through him without leaving a significant mark. His phone buzzed at 7:40. His son Tyler's contact photo, a photo Danny had taken last Thanksgiving. Tyler in a Titan sweatshirt, looking sideways at the camera with the slightly self-conscious expression of a 14-year-old who knows he's being photographed. Lit up the screen. Danny picked it up immediately. "Hey, bud." "Hey, Dad." Tyler's voice carried the particular morning roughness of a teenager, still partially submerged in sleep. "Still on for Saturday?" "Absolutely. I was thinking we go to Riverfront, walk around, maybe catch a bite at that barbecue place you like." A pause. "The one with the brisket?" "That's the one." "Yeah, okay. That works." Another pause. Longer this time, the comfortable kind that Danny had learned to read over the years. Tyler was a young man of considered silences, thoughtful in a way that felt familiar. "Hey, Dad?" "Yeah. I heard at school that George Strait played last night. Did you work it?" Danny looked out the window at the parking lot. "I worked it." "Was it good?" He considered the question for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It was good." After he hung up, Danny sat with his coffee and thought about the night before. He had finished his sweep of Level 2 sometime around 11:30, eventually circling back toward the tour bus, collecting himself, shaking off whatever had come over him. He had no memory of when exactly he'd stopped singing. The song had wound down of its own accord, simply running out of momentum, the way a thing does when it has said what it needed to say. He'd stood at that pillar for another minute or two in the silence that followed, feeling simultaneously lighter and more exposed than he had in years. And then he'd finished his round and gone back to the dock and signed out at 12:15 and driven home. He had not thought, even once, about whether anyone might have heard him. He got up and rinsed his coffee mug and put on his jacket and drove to the arena to pick up a form he'd forgotten to file the night before. A simple procedural thing, the kind of minor administrative task that the job occasionally threw up. The morning shift had already started, the building moving into its daytime configuration. Deliveries, administrative staff, the maintenance crews that appeared during the day and disappeared before the evening crowd arrived. He was heading down the corridor toward Pete Garza's office when Pete appeared from around a corner and stopped him with a look that Danny couldn't immediately categorize. Pete Garza was a compact man in his mid-50s, ex-military bearing still evident in the straight back and the quick eyes, who had run security at Bridgestone for 16 years. Danny respected him, and, on the rare occasions when he examined it, understood that he probably owed his continued employment largely to Pete's quiet advocacy over the years. Pete, who had brought him in when he needed work. Pete, who had given him the full-time position when it opened. Pete, who occasionally looked at Danny the way an older man looks at a younger one he suspects is wasting something. "There's a message for you," Pete said, in the tone of a man who has absorbed a surprising piece of information and is still processing it. "What kind of message?" Pete held out a white business card. Danny took it. On one side, the name of a management company, a name he recognized, one of the major Nashville outfits that handled major country artists. On the other side, a handwritten note in a plain, unhurried script. "Call me when you get a chance. George." Danny read it twice. Then he read it again. Where did this come from? His voice came out completely level, which surprised him. "Guy came in this morning. Kevin Blake said he was an assistant with the Strait organization. Left it at the front desk for you specifically. By name." Danny turned the card over in his fingers. The management company name stared up at him. "Must be some mistake," he said. Pete looked at him steadily. "Kowalski. Is there something about last night you want to tell me?" Danny stared at the card. The parking structure, the empty lot, the song moving through him before he could stop it. The way a river moves through a break in a dam. "I don't know," he said honestly. And that was the first true thing he'd said out loud, in longer than he could comfortably remember. He called from his car, sitting in the arena parking lot, his hands very still on the steering wheel. He did not let himself think too carefully about what he was doing, because he had the strong sense that thinking about it carefully would cause him to put the card back in his pocket and drive home. The phone rang 3 times. "Kevin Blake. This is Danny Kowalski. I'm a security guard at Bridgestone Arena. I got a card this morning with this number." A pause, brief, but with a specific quality to it, like a man recognizing a name he's been waiting to hear. "Mr. Kowalski." "Yes. Thanks for calling. 1 second." The sound of the phone being set down. Footsteps. A door. Then a voice that Danny had heard through walls and from a distance for 11 years. The voice of every radio in every truck on every road through the Permian Basin. Came on the line with the unhurried, direct quality of a man who did not waste words. "Mr. Kowalski, thank you for calling." Danny's hand tightened on the steering wheel. He said nothing. "I was on the bus last night. George Strait said. "Window was cracked. I heard you singing." The parking lot outside the windshield was unremarkable. Asphalt, white lines, a food truck setting up at the corner, a man walking a dog on the sidewalk. The most ordinary possible backdrop for the most disorienting conversation Danny had had in years. "I'm sorry," Danny said, because it was the first thing that came to him. "Don't be." A pause. "Where'd you learn to sing like that?" Danny let out a breath that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. "My dad's living room, West Texas." "How long since you've done anything with it?" 12 years. 12 years and 3 months and some number of days that he had never counted because counting would have made it too real. "A while," he said. "Do you write?" "I used to." The line was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of a man thinking something through, deciding something. Then, "I'd like to sit down with you if you're willing. Not for any particular reason. I'm not in the business of signing people to things, but I heard something last night that doesn't come along very often, and I'd like to hear more of it. That's the honest truth of it." Danny stared through the windshield. The man walking the dog had stopped to let it sniff at something near the curb. The food truck was unrolling its awning. Everything was completely, utterly normal. "Okay," Danny said. He didn't tell anyone. Not Pete, not Tyler on Saturday, at the barbecue place with the brisket, watching his son build a wall of empty sauce packets at the edge of the table, and talk about his basketball team and a history project, and a girl at school named Jessie Crawford, who he mentioned twice in passing, both times with studied casualness. Not his neighbor Frank Delgado, who sometimes had a beer with him on the building's shared stairwell landing in the evenings, and who generally talked about the predators and the traffic on I-65. Not anyone. He carried it alone, the way he had learned to carry most things. The card was in his wallet. The conversation replayed in fragments when he was trying to sleep. Not obsessively, but with the steady persistence of something that has taken root without permission. He had agreed to meet at a coffee shop on 12th Avenue South on Thursday morning, 2 days away. He had gone home and opened the closet in his bedroom and stood in front of the guitar case on the top shelf. The hard black case with the worn stickers on the side, a Yamaha acoustic that had traveled the roads with him from Texas to Nashville and back, and stood there for a long time without opening it. Then he had closed the closet and gone to bed. But on Wednesday night, he took it down. He sat on the edge of his bed with the case on the floor in front of him and looked at the latches for a full minute before releasing them. The hinges gave with the slight resistance of long disuse. The guitar lay in its molded foam interior, looking exactly as he remembered it. The spruce top slightly darkened at the sound hole from years of use, the rosewood fretboard worn smooth along the lines his fingers had traveled most often, a small ding on the lower bout that he'd gotten in a parking lot outside of Amarillo when he'd been 24, and careless. He picked it up. The familiar weight of it in his arms was like a physical sensation from a dream, something the body recognized before the mind caught up. He rested it against his knee and put his left hand on the neck and felt the strings under his fingers, and the calluses that had been there were gone now, the fingertips soft and civilian. He pressed the first chord, a G, the first chord Roy had ever taught him, and winced slightly at the bite of the unwound strings. He played it anyway. For 2 hours on Wednesday night, Danny Kowalski sat on the edge of his bed in his apartment on Gallatin Avenue and played guitar for the first time in 12 years, his fingers finding their way back to shapes they had never truly forgotten. His voice moving quietly through songs he had made up in his 20s and, in some cases, barely remembered. He played until his fingertips burned, and he was hoarse from singing at a volume just slightly above a whisper. And then he put the guitar back in the case and latched it. and set it against the wall beside the bed where he could see it from the pillow. He slept better that night than he had in years. He dreamed about Roy's living room, the afternoon light coming through the curtains, the sound of the martin, the smell of iced tea and oil field work and West Texas dust, the smell of being a child in a place where music was the truest language available. The coffee shop on 12th Avenue South was the kind of place Nashville did well. Exposed brick, good natural light, a chalkboard menu, the smell of quality coffee mixing with the morning air from the propped-open front door. It occupied a long, narrow space in a building that had probably been a hardware store or a tailor's shop at some point, and it was full at 9 in the morning with the particular Nashville mix of creative professionals and young professionals and people who could work from their laptops at any hour they chose. Danny arrived 8 minutes early and got a table toward the back, away from the window, which was where he would have sat regardless. He ordered a black coffee and watched the door. George Strait arrived exactly on time, with Kevin Blake a step behind him, both of them moving through the coffee shop with the slightly practiced normalcy of famous people in public. Present, but not performing presence, the art of occupying space without inviting attention. He was in a plain button-down shirt and a hat, and he looked like what he was. A man in his early 70s who had spent a great deal of his life outdoors, with a face that had weathered honestly and eyes that were direct without being aggressive. He shook Danny's hand with a firm grip and sat down across from him. And Kevin Blake took a seat at a separate table without being asked. A quiet, professional disappearance. "Thanks for coming," George said. "Thank you for the message," Danny said. George ordered coffee, and they sat for a moment in the comfortable, small talk that precedes important conversations. The weather, the tour, the building they were in, the nature of Nashville in the morning. Danny had expected to feel more unmoored by this meeting. Instead, he felt something closer to calm. The stillness that settles when a decision has already been made by some part of you that the thinking mind hasn't fully caught up to yet. Then George set down his coffee cup and said simply, "Tell me what happened." Danny looked at him. "What do you mean? A man with a voice like yours doesn't end up singing alone in a parking structure at 11 o'clock at night by accident. Something happened. I'd like to hear it if you're willing to tell it." Danny was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, 12th Avenue moved through its morning, indifferent and ordinary. A delivery driver double-parked. 2 women with strollers navigated the sidewalk. Nashville continuing to be Nashville. "My son," Danny said finally. "His name is Tyler. He was 2 years old." George waited. "I was playing a show in Murfreesboro. A Friday night, maybe 200 people. The kind of show that was going well. Everything connecting. You know that feeling?" He didn't wait for confirmation. "I had a guy from a management company in the crowd, someone who had come specifically to see me, based on a demo I'd circulated. It was the closest I'd gotten to a real conversation with someone who could actually move things forward." He turned the coffee cup between his hands. Diane called during the second set. Tyler was sick. Fever. Not terrible, but she was scared. He was too. And she was alone with him. And she was scared. He paused. "I finished the set. I didn't leave. I stayed and finished the set, and talked to the management guy, and drove home at 1 in the morning." The coffee shop moved around them. The espresso machine hissed. Someone laughed at a table near the front. By the time I got home, Tyler was okay. The fever had broken. He was asleep. Diane was sitting in the rocking chair in his room in the dark, and she looked at me when I came in the door, and she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Danny looked up. "He was fine," Danny said. "He was completely fine. And I have told myself that 1,000 times. And it doesn't change the fact that I chose a show over my sick child, and I went home to a wife who was sitting in the dark alone because I wasn't there. And the look on her face when I walked in that door is something I have not been able to get out of my head for 12 years. The table was quiet. I quit playing 2 weeks later. Diane and I lasted another 8 months before she asked me to leave. Not over that night specifically. There were other things, the accumulation of things, the way ambition hollows out a marriage if you're not careful. But that night was when I understood what kind of man I was capable of being, and I didn't want to be that man anymore. I thought if I gave up the music, I gave up the thing that had made me that man. He stopped. The coffee shop continued around them, bright and ordinary. George Strait sat across from him and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did giving it up fix anything?" Danny looked at him. "No." "Did it hurt your son?" "Not directly. But," he stopped, thought, "it made me smaller. And Tyler sees a smaller version of his father than he should have, than he deserves." George turned his coffee cup. "The music didn't make you leave that night. You made that choice." "I know. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since, by burying the thing that had nothing to do with it." Danny said nothing. "That's not humility," George said, with no particular edge in his voice. "That's something else." He called Roy that evening from his apartment, the guitar case open on the floor beside him. Roy was 76 now, and living in the same house on Clement Street in Odessa that Danny had grown up in. Still self-sufficient, still driving himself to the grocery store and the doctor, but slower, Danny had noticed on his last visit, with the careful deliberateness of a man compensating for a body that no longer did what it was asked without negotiation. "Hey, Dad!" "Danny." Roy's voice on the phone was the same as it had always been. Low, unhurried, with the particular Permian Basin flatness that Danny had never entirely lost himself. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine. He looked at the guitar. "I started playing again." A long pause, long enough that Danny checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Well," Roy said finally, and then nothing else for a moment. And Danny understood that the silence was the fullness of what Roy meant. "I met someone," Danny said. "Someone who... It's a long story, but it made me think I've been doing something wrong for a while." "Okay. I think I owe you an apology, actually." "For what?" "You gave me something. The guitar, the music. You gave it to me, and I put it in a closet. And I think I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true." Roy was quiet for another moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as always, low and steady. But there was something in it that Danny hadn't heard in a long time. Something that might have been relief. "Don't worry about owing me anything. I just want you to be well. I'm working on it." "Good." A pause. "Your mother used to say you sang in your sleep when you were small. Did I ever tell you that?" "No." "You did? Just fragments of things. Songs you'd heard during the day." She thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Another pause. She wasn't wrong about much. Danny sat with that for a moment, the guitar between his hands, the apartment quiet around him. "I love you, Dad." Roy made a small sound that was not quite words, but communicated everything. "Come visit soon," he said. What Danny did not tell Roy, what he told almost no one over the next 3 weeks, as the meetings with George Strait's circle continued in the careful, undramatic way that George seemed to approach everything, was the full extent of what was being discussed. It was not, as George had said that first morning, about signing anything or producing anything or inserting Danny into the machinery of the music industry. It was something more specific, more personal, and in some ways more terrifying. George was preparing a final recording project, a collection of duets and collaborations with singers and songwriters he admired and wanted to document a connection with before the formal arc of his career closed. Not a commercial release in the traditional sense, but something that mattered to him. Something that would exist and be heard by people who cared about this kind of music. He wanted Danny to contribute 3 original songs, not as a performer, not as an artist being launched or represented, just as a songwriter. 3 songs to be considered for inclusion, written and delivered on Danny's own terms, recorded in a single session if they decided to move forward, with no obligation beyond the work itself. Danny had sat with this for a week before he said yes. The yes had not come easily. It had come after 3 separate nights of sitting with the guitar and writing, not finishing anything, just opening the channels, letting the water run through the pipes that had been sealed for 12 years, getting used to the feeling of the thing again. It had come after a long walk along the Cumberland on a Tuesday morning when he stopped on one of the pedestrian bridges and watched the river for 20 minutes and tried to identify, honestly, what he was afraid of. What he was afraid of, he concluded, was not failure. It was not humiliation or judgment or the indifference of an audience. What he was afraid of was that Tyler would find out. Not from shame. He did not want his son to know he was doing this from shame of the music or shame of the aspiration. He was afraid that Tyler would see his father trying again, and that Tyler would hope for something, and that the hoping would lead to disappointment, and that Danny would be the cause of that disappointment in his son's life one more time. It was a fear so precise and specific that identifying it clearly made it less overwhelming, if not smaller. He called Diane. Diane Calloway. She had gone back to her family name after the divorce, taught 2nd grade at a school in Brentwood, lived in a modest house she'd bought herself 3 years ago, and had, in the decade since the divorce, become something that Danny found harder to hold a grudge against than he might have wished. A reasonable person. They were not friends, not quite, but they had arrived at a functional, adult cordiality for Tyler's sake that required each of them to see the other as more than the flat figures of an ended marriage. He met her for coffee at a place near her school on a weekday afternoon. She was in her work clothes, a cardigan and slacks, her dark hair shorter than she'd worn it when they were married. And she looked, as she always did to Danny, like someone who had done the work of rebuilding herself without making a public project of it. He told her about the parking structure, about the card, about the meetings, about what George Strait had asked. She listened with the complete level attention that had always been one of her most disorienting qualities. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you telling me?" "Because of Tyler." She studied him. "What about Tyler? If I do this, if I actually do this, and it becomes something he knows about, I don't want him to find out from someone else. I don't want him to be surprised by it, and I wanted to know if you thought it was a mistake." Diane turned her coffee cup on the table, a gesture Danny recognized. She did it when she was thinking something she wasn't sure how to say. "Danny, yeah, do you know what Tyler said to me last month? He said..." She stopped, restarted. "He asked me once why you stopped playing. He was 12. I didn't know what to tell him, so I said you'd gotten busy with work." She looked up. He said, "That's not why. He got sad about something, and he stopped doing the thing he loved because he was sad. And now he's sadder." Danny looked at her. "He said that. He's 14, and he sees you more clearly than you see yourself." She paused. "Don't do this for Tyler. Do it because it's yours. But don't pretend that hiding it from him is protecting him. It isn't." He drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the interstate, the long way through East Nashville with its shotgun houses and its murals and its lived-in, complicated beauty. He thought about Tyler at 12, making that observation with the quiet precision of a child who pays attention. He thought about what it meant to be seen that clearly by your own son and still be afraid. He picked up his phone at a red light and sent Tyler a text. "Doing anything Saturday morning before I pick you up?" Tyler responded 3 minutes later. "No." Why? Danny typed, "Want to show you something." He told Tyler on Saturday morning, sitting in the car in the parking lot of a park in Hermitage, with the guitar case in the back seat and the late September light coming through the windshield at the angle that made Nashville look for a moment like some idealized version of itself, golden and clean and larger than it actually was. He didn't deliver it as a speech. He had rehearsed nothing. He simply said, "The way you say the things that matter. I've been playing again." And something happened. Something I want to tell you about. I need you to know the whole story. Tyler listened the way he had always listened, with his body still and his face attentive, the 14-year-old version of the focused silence Roy had always carried. He asked 3 questions during the account. Did you actually meet him? And what did he ask you to write? And, quietly, after a pause that lasted nearly 30 seconds, why did you stop in the first place? Danny told him. Not the managed version, the real one. The show in Murfreesboro. The management guy. The phone call. Finishing the set. Diane in the rocking chair in the dark. Tyler absorbed this for a long moment. His face did not collapse or harden. It did something more complex than either, a series of small adjustments that Danny watched without trying to interpret. Then Tyler said, "You've been punishing yourself this whole time." Danny looked at his son. "Yeah, for something that turned out okay. For who I was capable of being, not for the outcome." Tyler was quiet for another moment. Then, "Can I hear it?" The guitar. Danny got out of the car and opened the back door and took out the guitar case, and they walked to a picnic table at the edge of the park under a tree that had begun to turn. The earliest edge of orange just appearing in the outermost leaves. Danny sat on the table with his feet on the bench, and Tyler sat beside him. And Danny opened the case and took out the Yamaha and adjusted his position and played the first few bars of Foolhardy Memory, where everything had started, where the breach in the dam had first appeared. He played it quietly, the park around them, a dog being walked in the middle distance, a family at a grill 100 yards away. Tyler sat with his hands on his knees, watching his father's hands on the strings, listening with his whole self. When the song ended, neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're good," Tyler said. It was such a simple thing, such a plain, direct, 14-year-old thing to say, that Danny almost didn't trust himself to answer. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Tyler looked at the guitar, then at his father. "I knew you would be. I've always known that." Danny looked at his son. The shape of his face, the particular way he held his jaw that was entirely his own, the directness of his gaze that came from somewhere in the Callaway line, and felt something that had been knotted in his chest for 12 years give a small, painful, necessary release. "I have something to ask you," Danny said. "What?" "I need to write 3 songs in 3 weeks. I have the material. I've been writing every night this week. But I've been thinking about one of them, the one about your grandfather, and I'd like to play it for you before I finalize it. I'd like to know if you think it's right." Tyler blinked. "Why me?" "Because you knew him from the outside in a way I never could. And because—" He stopped. "Because I want you to be part of this. Not as a favor. Because it matters to me that you are." Tyler said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the same decisive nod that Roy had always used when a decision was made, and didn't require further elaboration. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The 3 weeks were the most demanding and the most alive that Danny had felt since he was 27 years old. He wrote in the early mornings before work, at the kitchen table with the guitar and a notebook and the French press, the city outside the window still dark. He wrote on his lunch break in the arena's back corridor, sitting on a folding chair with a small notebook. Not the music itself, but the architecture of it, the progression of the ideas, the emotional logic that had to hold the song together. He wrote late at night after his shift, the apartment quiet, working through structures and revisions with the focused intensity of someone who understands that the work has an internal standard it is trying to meet, and that the meeting of that standard requires honesty rather than cleverness. The first song was the easiest. It was the one that had been waiting the longest, the one about being young in West Texas and having something given to you before you understood what it was worth. It was, at its core, about Roy, though Roy's name never appeared in it. It was about the specific education of a father who could not say the words but could play the chords, and about the son who received that education through his hands before he understood it with his mind. He played it for Tyler on a Wednesday night. Tyler sitting on the couch in Danny's apartment with a can of soda, his homework spread on the coffee table in the familiar, comfortable chaos of a teenager's study method. Tyler listened with his forearms on his knees, leaning forward, and when Danny reached the chorus, the one about driving west with the radio up, about the particular light over the Permian Basin at dusk, about the way some things are passed from one generation to another without language, Tyler looked up with the slightly startled expression of a person who has heard something that reaches them before they've decided whether to let it. "That's about Grandpa Roy," Tyler said. "Yeah." Tyler was quiet for a moment. "He's going to hear it? Eventually? If I do this right." Tyler looked at the soda can in his hands. "He's going to cry. Roy Kowalski does not cry. He's going to almost cry," Tyler said, with a precision that made Danny laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. "He's going to get very quiet, and then say something short, and then go stand outside." Danny was still smiling when he said, "That's exactly right." The second song was harder. It was about the night in Murfreesboro. Not directly, not with the specificity of a diary entry, but with the honest reckoning of it, the examination of the particular pride that had kept him in that room when his child was sick. He wrestled with it for 10 days, writing and discarding and rebuilding, trying to find the version that was honest without being self-pitying, that acknowledged the failure without performing regret for an audience. The line he kept coming back to, the line that eventually became the spine of the whole thing, was, "A man can be two things at once and wrong in both of them." He played it for Diane in her kitchen on a Thursday evening while Tyler was at basketball practice. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and listened without moving. And when he finished, she sat in silence for a full minute. "That's the truest thing you've ever written," she said. "Is it too much?" She shook her head slowly. "It's exactly enough." He drove home feeling something he had forgotten the name of. Not happiness, exactly, but the specific satisfaction of having made a thing that did what it was supposed to do. The feeling of having told the truth in the only language he fully trusted. The third song took him the longest. He had known from the first conversation with George Strait's people that the third song would be the hardest, because the first two were about things that had already happened, things that had shape and resolution and the clean edges of the past. The third song had to be about something that was still happening, still unresolved, still in motion. It had to be about now. He spent 4 days not writing it. He carried a notebook everywhere and opened it and closed it and opened it again, and nothing came that felt right. Nothing had the density of the real thing, the weight of something true rather than something constructed to sound true. It was Pete Garza who broke it open, without meaning to. Danny was doing a routine walkthrough of the arena on a Tuesday morning, 11 days before the recording session, and Pete fell into step beside him the way he occasionally did when he wanted to talk about something without making an appointment of it. "You seem different," Pete said, not looking at him. "Different how?" "Less underground." Pete was quiet for a moment. "I've worked with you for 11 years, Kowalski. You know what you've always reminded me of? A man who decided he had to make himself smaller to fit the life he was living. Like you shrank yourself down to the job, to the apartment, to the Saturday barbecues. Nothing wrong with any of those things. But you were always too big for the frame you put yourself in." Danny kept walking. "I don't say that as a criticism," Pete said. "I say it as a man who did the same thing for a while and had to get talked out of it by my wife at 44. He paused. "Whatever's happening with you, keep doing it." They walked another 20 yards in silence. "I'm writing a song about that," Danny said. Pete looked at him sideways. "About what?" "About a man who made himself smaller than he was, and then someone heard him when he thought no one was listening, and he had to figure out what to do with being heard." Pete nodded slowly. "That's a good song." "I hope so," Danny said. "I haven't finished it yet." But he knew. Walking the familiar corridor of the arena, with the morning light coming through the high windows and the building humming around him with its ordinary day, that he had just found the spine of the third song. Not in the writing, not at the kitchen table, but here, in the middle of his actual life, in a conversation with a man who had been watching him for 11 years and had decided this morning to say so. He wrote the third song that night in 2.5 hours. It came out nearly whole, the way the best things come. Not effortlessly, but inevitably, as though it had been assembled in the dark and was simply waiting to be recognized. It was about the particular invisibility that a person can cultivate as a form of self-protection, about being overheard, about the terror and the grace of being seen by someone who has no reason to see you and no agenda in the seeing. He played it through once when he finished, just past midnight, sitting on the edge of his bed with the guitar on his knee and the apartment dark except for the lamp on the nightstand. His voice moved through the room, steady and unguarded. And when it ended, he sat in the silence for a moment and thought, "Yes, that's it. That's the true one." He set the guitar against the wall and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. 3 songs. Done. 2 days before the recording session, he drove to Odessa. He hadn't planned to. He had planned to spend the day before the session resting, going over the songs one more time, arriving at the studio the next morning in the best possible shape. But he woke on Thursday to a gray Nashville morning, and the certainty, immediate and non-negotiable, that he needed to see his father first. He called Roy at 7. "I'm coming down." A pause. "When?" "Today. I'll be there by 5. Another pause. The particular Roy Kowalski pause that had always communicated a recalibration. A man adjusting his internal picture of the day. "I'll make something to eat," he said. Danny drove the 8 hours largely in silence. No radio. The guitar case in the back seat. The landscape changing from the green and rolling Tennessee hills to the flat brown immensity of West Texas with the gradual authority of a world announcing itself. He had always loved this drive in reverse, the way Texas eventually became more than scenery, became something you felt in the body, an openness that pressed against the chest from the outside instead of the inside. He pulled onto Clement Street at 5:10, the evening light going amber and horizontal across the flat lots and the familiar sequence of houses that he had known since childhood. Roy's house looked the same as it always had, the same brown brick and the same mesquite in the front yard, the porch light already on. Roy met him at the door with the same handshake that had always been Roy's primary greeting. Firm, brief, the handshake of a man who expressed through the palm what he couldn't quite put in words. He looked smaller than Danny remembered, in the specific way that parents shrink when you're not watching them regularly. Not diminished, exactly, but reduced to their essential dimensions. They ate at the kitchen table. Roy had made a pot of chili, the exact chili he had made since Danny was 10 years old, with cornbread from a box that neither of them had ever thought to replace with the real thing. They talked about Tyler, about Nashville, about a neighbor on Clement Street who had recently retired from the school district. Roy asked about the job, and Danny answered and then set down his spoon and said, "I need to play you something." Roy looked at him. "I wrote a song about you," Danny said. "I want you to hear it before anyone else does." Roy said nothing. His hand was still on the table beside his bowl, and Danny watched the slight stillness come over him that meant he was managing something internal. Danny got the guitar from the car and sat in the living room chair across from Roy on the couch, in the room where Roy had taught him the first chord 30 years ago. The Martin D28 was still in the corner. Roy still played, still sat here on Sunday afternoons in the old way. The curtains were the same curtains, or curtains that looked exactly like them. The light was the late-day West Texas light that made the room feel amber and permanent. He played the song about his father. Roy sat completely still through all 3 verses, and the chorus, and the final verse, his hands on his knees, his face with the careful, controlled expression of a man who is absorbing something that is going into a deep place and moving things around in there. When it ended, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Roy looked at the window for a moment. Then he stood up and said, "I'm going to get some air," and walked out the back door. Danny sat with the guitar on his knee and looked at the empty couch and heard Tyler's voice, precise and knowing. He's going to almost cry. He's going to get very quiet, and then say something short, and then go stand outside. He waited. Roy came back in 5 minutes later and sat back down on the couch and looked at Danny directly and said, "That's the best thing you've ever done." And Danny believed him. The studio was a converted Victorian house in East Nashville that had been running sessions for 25 years. Worn wooden floors, high ceilings, good acoustics, the accumulated quiet of a building that had absorbed a great deal of music without becoming precious about it. Danny had driven past it hundreds of times without knowing what it was. He walked in on a Friday morning in early October with his guitar case and a notebook and a knot in his sternum that he breathed through methodically while Kevin Blake showed him the layout. George Strait arrived at 9:15 with a small entourage that efficiently became almost invisible. The producer, a calm, precise man named Dale Whitmore, who had the focused quietness of someone who understood that his job was to capture something, not to manufacture it, walked Danny through the setup. A main vocal booth, a secondary room for acoustic guitar, a window between them so that eye contact was possible. Simple. Clean. "We're not after perfect," Dale said, in the direct way of someone delivering information rather than reassurance. "We're after real. The 2 things that sound similar are actually opposites. Keep that in mind." Danny nodded. George came into the main room and shook Danny's hand and said, simply, "Ready?" "No," Danny said honestly. "But I'm here." George smiled. That's usually the same thing. They recorded the first song, the one about Roy, about West Texas, about the Martin D28 and the chords learned through the hands before the mind understood them, in 3 takes. The first take had the roughness of a first take, the slight hesitation of a body that hasn't committed fully yet. The second take was technically cleaner, but had lost something indefinable in the cleaning. The third take was the one. Danny felt it while it was happening. the particular alignment of voice and instrument and intention that produced the thing itself rather than a representation of it. The note he sang at the end of the second chorus, the one he hadn't known he was going to sustain until he did, the one that hung in the room and then let go. That was the note that Dale Whitmore, behind the glass, heard and looked up from his console at. And when Danny opened his eyes, George Strait was watching him from across the room with an expression that didn't require translation. Between takes, Danny sat on the stool in the vocal booth and breathed and tried not to think about the magnitude of what was happening. He was largely unsuccessful at the not thinking, but he had learned in the 3 weeks since the parking structure that the thinking didn't have to stop the doing. The fear and the action could exist simultaneously. In fact, they probably had to. The second song, the Murfreesboro song, the one about pride and the cost of it, took longer. 5 takes, with a break in the middle where Danny stood outside in the small garden behind the house for 7 minutes, looking at the October sky over East Nashville, feeling the cool air against his face and letting the second verse reassemble itself in his chest. The 5th take was honest in a way that the first 4, for all their technical competence, had not been. He had stopped managing the emotion halfway through the 3rd verse and simply allowed himself to mean what he was saying. And the voice had responded to that permission with something that surprised him, a depth of tone and feeling that he had not known he still had access to. When it ended, Dale Whitmore's voice came through the monitor. "That's it. That's the one." George Strait said nothing for a moment. Then, yeah, they broke for lunch. Kevin Blake had arranged sandwiches in the kitchen of the Victorian house, and Danny sat at the kitchen table with George Strait and Dale Whitmore, and ate a turkey sandwich and drank water and talked about nothing consequential for 30 minutes. About East Nashville, about the changing character of the city, about a fly fishing trip George had taken in Montana the previous spring. The ordinary conversation of people who have done something real together and are allowing the ordinariness of lunch to settle it into the body before moving on. George asked Danny, over the remains of his sandwich, "What are you going to do after today?" Danny considered the question. "Go back to work Monday. At the arena." "At the arena." George nodded slowly, as though the answer was not unexpected. "And the music?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "I think the music was always going to be part of my life. I just decided it wasn't because it was easier than deciding what it actually meant." He paused. "I'm not trying to build a career. I'm 41 years old, and I have a job and an apartment, and a son I see on weekends, and a father in West Texas who is going to listen to that first song on repeat in his truck until the speakers give out." He paused. "But I'm not putting the guitar back in the closet." George looked at him with the steady, undemonstrative attention that Danny had learned over the past weeks was the most consistent thing about him. "Fair enough," he said. "I do have one question," Danny said. "What's that?" "That night in the parking structure, when did you realize I was there? How long were you listening before I knew you were there?" George was quiet for a moment. A slight smile moved across his face, unhurried and genuine. "From the first note," he said. "I heard you from the first note." The 3rd song, the one about invisibility, about being overheard, about the grace of being seen without warning, was recorded in a single take. Danny walked into the vocal booth and put on the headphones and settled the guitar and looked through the window at Dale Whitmore behind the glass and George Strait sitting in the corner of the control room on a wooden stool. And he played the song from beginning to end without stopping, without hesitation, without the internal management that the first 2 songs had required. It came out whole because it was about a moment that had been whole. The parking structure, the empty lot, the cracked window, the song moving through the night air to a listener he hadn't known was there. It was the shortest of the three songs, less than 4 minutes, but it had the specific gravity of something compressed. The density of a story that knew exactly how much space it needed and didn't take more. When the last chord decayed into the room's silence, Danny sat very still for a moment with his eyes closed. Then Dale Whitmore's voice. Perfect. Danny opened his eyes. Through the glass, he could see George Strait on his stool, his hands resting on his knees, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has heard something go exactly where it was supposed to go. Danny set the guitar across his knees and exhaled. He called Tyler from the parking lot of the studio at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the October sun overhead, the red and gold of the East Nashville trees moving in a light wind. Tyler picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" "Good," Danny said. "Really good." "Yeah?" "Yeah." He leaned against the car, looking up at the trees. "You still want to come over tonight? I can make pasta." "Sure. Can we watch something?" "Anything you want." A pause. "Dad." "Yeah, I'm proud of you." Danny was quiet for a moment. The trees moved in the wind. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something, and the sound of it, ordinary and immediate and alive, seemed to Danny like the exact right accompaniment to this specific moment. "I love you, bud," he said. "Love you too. See you tonight?" He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the parking lot for a moment longer, his hands loose at his sides, the afternoon moving around him. Nashville in October, the city he had arrived in at 22, with a guitar and $2,000 and the particular hunger of a young man who understood something was possible without knowing precisely what. The city that had given him a career he hadn't planned, a life smaller than the one he'd imagined, a son who was clearer-eyed than his father, a job that had placed him in the right corridor at the right time on the right August night. He thought about Roy sitting in the living room on Clement Street in the amber light, the Martin in the corner, the clock ticking on the mantel. He thought about Diane in her kitchen in Brentwood, the directness of her attention, the things she had said that were hard to hear because they were true. He thought about Pete Garza walking the corridor beside him, saying, "You were always too big for the frame you put yourself in." The plain, useful, unrepeatable kindness of being told the truth by someone who has earned the right to tell it. He thought about a cracked window in a parking structure, and a song moving through the night air, and a man sitting still in the dark listening to every word. Roy Kowalski drove from Odessa to Nashville in November, the same route he'd driven to Danny's wedding 20 years before. The same pickup truck now with 200,000 more miles on it, and a new set of tires he'd had put on specifically for the trip. He arrived on a Friday evening, and Danny and Tyler met him in the parking lot of Danny's building. Tyler taller than Roy now by 2 inches, both of them slightly startled by this fact. Roy shook Danny's hand and then, for the first time in either of their memories, pulled him into a brief, gruff, completely sincere embrace. The embrace of a man who had decided that something was more important than his own reticence, and acted accordingly. Then he stepped back and looked at Tyler. "You look like your father at 14, Roy said. Tyler looked at Danny. Danny shrugged. "Is that good?" Tyler asked. Roy considered this with his characteristic deliberateness. "He turned out all right," he said finally. "Eventually." They had dinner at the barbecue place with the brisket, Danny, Tyler, Roy, and Roy ordered the brisket and ate it with the focused appreciation of a man who took good food seriously. And Tyler asked Roy about the oil fields, and Roy answered in the measured, unhurried way that he answered everything. And Danny sat across from both of them and watched his son interview his father and felt the particular form of happiness that has no name, because it is too specific to require one. The happiness of a dinner table. the happiness of a lineage visible in two faces across a restaurant booth, the happiness of a man who almost destroyed his own life, but didn't, and found his way back to the essential thing by the improbable grace of a cracked window and a song in the dark. The recording was released in the spring of the following year, not as a commercial single, not through the standard industry architecture, but as part of the collection George Strait had described. A quiet release, distributed through streaming platforms and available in physical form, through a small independent label that handled exactly this kind of project. 3 songs, credited as written by Danny Kowalski. His name in the liner notes in plain type, the same size as everyone else's. Danny heard it for the first time on a Tuesday morning in his apartment, alone, at the kitchen table with his coffee. He listened to all 3 songs through once, without moving. The first song, the Roy song, the West Texas song, came out of the speakers with a clarity that made his chest tighten. The second song hit him lower, in the place where the 12-year shame had lived. The third song he listened to with his eyes closed, and when it ended, he sat in the silence for a long moment. Then he got up and put his jacket on and drove to work. Pete Garza was standing at the coffee maker in the break room when Danny walked in. He looked up, registered something in Danny's face, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "It's out? This morning?" Pete nodded. He poured his coffee and handed the carafe to Danny and leaned against the counter. "And?" Danny poured his own coffee and thought about how to answer. The parking structure on a hot August night. The song finding its way out of him before he could stop it. A cracked window and a man in the dark, listening. A father in a living room in West Texas. A son with a wall of sauce packets and clear eyes, and a 14-year-old's terrible, precise insight. A guitar that had been in a closet for 12 years, waiting. "Good," Danny said. "It's good." Pete looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They stood at the coffee maker in the break room of Bridgestone Arena on a Tuesday morning in spring, 2 men drinking their coffee before the workday began, and outside the windows of the building, Nashville was doing what it always did. Moving forward, carrying its music and its noise and its complicated, beautiful, indifferent life. And Danny Kowalski was part of it, present and visible, standing in a frame that finally fit.